All right. Now that we've covered the general gist of what people in the field of developmental psychology believe, we're going to move on to the next big thing. And you're going to see this is very prominent throughout the entire class. And that's the notion that when we study development, there are many different areas that we can actually look at. So what we're going to do here in the next couple seconds is just talk about several of the areas of psychology that we're going to be exploring throughout the entire semester. When we talk about changes, what we see is that usually comes in three different forms, or at least most developmental psychologists describe it in three different forms. The first form that we ever started studying, the one that people still are keenly attuned to, is that a lot of our changes happen biologically. So we see changes in our physical structure, we see changes within our nervous system, we see changes happening in a visible way throughout the entire lifespan. And many people, when studying this particular concept of development, can settle on that and find tons of interesting things to study within the biological processes changes that we go through. But some people have argued that just studying biology, just studying the physical change of a person, isn't necessarily hitting on all the different things that people experience. When later researcher after developmental psychology informed, named Jean Piaget, who we'll study in much greater detail later on, argued that in addition to seeing the body unfold, we also have our mind changing throughout our entire lifespan. We come to new epiphanies, we come to new realizations, new ways of thinking of how the world works. Our intelligence alters in different ways. Language skills develop in different ways depending upon the environment and what age somebody is. When talking about change, a lot of people now argue that it's just as important to talk about what's going on inside the head as it is outside of the body, or I guess inside the body as well. So many people in this field now not only explore biological processes but cognitive processes, and sometimes they explore kind of the area where these two overlap. And lastly, one of the newer growing areas in developmental psychology, one that's very interesting to people, is what we call socio-emotional processing. Changes in people's emotional regulation, their temperaments, personality styles, the way they interact with people, either both sexually or kind of socially. We also can talk about moral change and development. So when we look at this idea of the processing and change, the original idea was that, well, we could just study the physical changes that happen within an individual, maybe how it impacts their psychological well-being. But nowadays we see that cognitive processes and social emotional processes are also very important areas to explore. And oftentimes we also see that these things overlap, that they're not completely distinct from each other. And what we're going to be doing in this class throughout the semester is kind of picking at each of these different areas and trying to see how different topics within these areas do show the unfolding process. We're going to start with biological changes, move on to cognitive changes, and then close the class out with socio-emotional changes that people undergo throughout their entire lifespan. But when we're doing this, we'll always be kind of recognizing that these things tend to overlap. So even though we might be talking about socio-emotional changes at the end, you'll hear biological topics pop up. When we talk about cognitive processes, sometimes we'll talk about social factors that play a role in these things. Because even though we might study these things independently, we have to acknowledge within the field that there is a great amount of overlap between all three of these different areas when we look at the developmental process. Another thing that we have to recognize throughout this class is that when we're studying change, we do have to study it in different age groups, because we don't just have one epiphany for cognitive processes that happen at 5 and then nothing else happens. We don't have just biological changes happening in our first early years and then nothing happens. Instead, what we see for all three of these different areas is that we're constantly changing throughout our lifespan. So what we're going to be doing when we address each of these separate areas is talking about the general gist of the topic. So biological processes, we can talk about the unfolding nervous system, but then look at how the nervous system unfolds in our prenatal development, in infancy, in childhood, in early adulthood, and even up to late adulthood. We'll talk about all the different changes that happen within the body. And we're going to do this for all the different sections so you can see how each of these different areas are prominent throughout our entire life. It's not just one area that develops separately from the rest of them. There is something, though, that we do need to take caution in when we're talking about this idea of age and the changes that happen. Usually when we talk about all the topics in class, I'm going to be discussing people's chronological ages. So I'll say in your early adulthood, which is usually 20s to 30s, these things happen. In your middle adulthood, 40s to 50s, these things happen. In late adulthood, 60 beyond, these things happen. Well, these are all kind of general characteristics that we assume with most individuals. But sometimes when we look at lifespan development, one thing that we often see with individuals is there's always exceptions to the norm. Somebody's chronological age very often doesn't match up with one of their types of other ages: biological age, cognitive age, or social age. And because of that, sometimes the rules for specific individuals might not apply. I guess the rules that we have for most individuals might not apply to a specific individual. They might not kind of fit that general characteristic that we assume about a person. So you might see somebody in their 50s displaying a social age that more is reminiscent of a teenager. You might see some children who are so unbelievably intelligent and have had so much extra training or encountered so many things that their cognitive age is actually significantly beyond what we would expect. You might have some individuals who have maintained very healthy lives who have a biological age that's significantly younger than their chronological age. So when we talk about development, we're usually going to focus on chronological age, but I do want you to kind of tend to this notion that sometimes chronological ages don't always predict successfully a person's biological, cognitive, or social age. And when that's the case, you're going to have to take those things into account when looking at how lifespan development would actually unfold for these specific individuals. All right, now we've covered 2/3 of what we're going to be covering in this lecture. We've actually flew through this really quick. But there's one last area that's going to take a little bit more time to discuss, and it's some of the terms that relate to methodology that are used within the field of developmental psychology. Now, these concepts, these ideas are something that are often used in many other areas of psychology, so you might have heard of many of the concepts before, but some of them are particularly of interest to people within the field of developmental psychology. And because of that, I want to spend some time just discussing those ideas, so when you hear the terminology, when you hear the concepts mentioned later, you're familiar with what those concepts or those ideas actually are. One of the first things that we need to be familiar with is how developmental psychologists actually come up with the results or the research that they design. In particular, we want to know how developmental psychologists study people. And when we look at all the different techniques that are found within the field of developmental psychology, what we see is that there's actually a lot of tools at our disposal within the field. One of the first tools we ever developed within the field of developmental psychology, and psychology in particular, is what we call case studies. Now, case studies are not something that involves a briefcase or some long-winded story. Instead, what we see with case studies are very detailed observations, usually of one particular individual or a very small set of individuals, that can give us an inkling about how something works. When we talk about early research and development, we usually hear about these exceptional cases, people who couldn't speak because of an early exposure that they didn't have, or somebody who had a major cognitive deficit because something happened to them in their life. Well, these examples really give researchers a sense of what might be critical or what might really impact lifespan development when we see people who don't necessarily follow the traditional script that we see in most individuals. Now, case studies are very enlightening, but many developmental psychologists argue that they should only be the starting point for our understanding of how development actually happens. Many researchers have argued that even though case studies can be a great starting point, it should never be the end point. Instead, what we need to do is run studies with larger samples of individuals, collect more pieces of data, so we can be much more certain of the results that we've actually obtained. And one of the ways we can do this, something that's picked up in popularity over the last couple decades, is something that we call observational studies, where we can look at the unfolding process, we can look at kind of how a person develops by simply observing them in their everyday activities. And these observational studies can happen in a number different ways. Sometimes observational studies involve situations where people are completely oblivious to the fact that they're being observed. Researchers essentially go out into a person's normal environment and observe them secretly watching their everyday behaviors. And this can give us some subtle information on how people act socially, how people act cognitively around specific scenarios. Other observational studies are much more invasive. So people will be put into labs and kind of given specific stimuli, and we look at how they interact with these particular things. We're going to talk a little bit later about a classic experiment, which I guess isn't necessarily an experiment, it's more of an observational study, called the Mary Ainsworth's Strange Situation. It's a great example of an observational study where the entire environment is contrived. Everything is created to see how a child interacts, but it can give us more information about the developmental process through what's observed in the behavior of these children in these very, very generated experiences. Another thing that we can do is actually run tests. So put one person in one situation, test them, and then put them in a second situation and test them. Or compare two different groups of individuals that have been exposed to different types of environments, maybe even different types of upbringings, and see how these things actually play out in a person's development. Now, these tests do usually involve some type of experimental manipulation. There's need for control. But when you have these types of environments, which are sometimes very difficult to accomplish, you can start talking about things like causation. You can start talking about how, a person is impacted by their environment instead of seeing the unfolding process develop without real certainty. And because of that, tests or experimentation is something that's really a lofty goal for a lot of developmental psychologists. And unfortunately, due to ethical constraints, time constraints, there's a very large lack of tests that we can do. I guess there's a big lacking in tests that we can do within the field of developmental psychology simply because of how long this unfolding process takes place in this particular environment. But when we can run these tests or experiments, a lot of information can come from them. Another way we can conduct studies on topics is just by simply asking people about themselves, asking about life events that might have shaped them, things that they encountered along the way, so we can get a description of the unfolding process from their own perspective. And the last thing that we've developed over the last few decades, in fact the last 20 or 30 years, are physiological measures that can tell us about what's going on internally within an individual when they are changing, when their life is becoming something different from what it was before. And this can involve hormone measures, this can involve brain activity measures, this can involve just basic physiological changes that occur when somebody's in a different environment. And all of these things can add extra layers to the story that we have and how a person develops and changes. And when we use all of these in combination, we can get a very, very dense story about how the unfolding process happens in a number of different areas of developmental psychology. Another thing that's really important to understand the difference of as we progress throughout the class is the difference between comparison tests and correlation tests. So oftentimes people will talk about how as you age your intelligence lowers. Well, those findings can come from a number of different places. That particular example of age and IQ changing or age and height changing usually relates to what we call correlation or change tests. We measure a whole large sample of individuals at one point in time, and we look at whether or not there's trends within those individuals across different age groups. And a great example of this is the picture that you see in the upper right-hand corner, where we measure the heights of multiple individuals throughout their entire lifespan. So we can look for kind of those changes in height that might occur as we get into our older years. But other times, these particular types of studies don't necessarily tell us everything that we're interested in, especially if we're running experimental studies or we're looking at large groups of individuals that we want to kind of clump together. If that's the case, then we usually have to measure the actual differences between groups. So we can measure, say, the incidences of heart attacks that happen for young kids, teenagers, adults, early adults, late adults, and all the other things that are out there. Or we can measure the number of individuals, I guess, who, I don't even see what that particular example is about in the lower right-hand corner. But what is that, actually? Yeah, I guess it's not that important. But we can measure, say, the differences between individuals who encountered one particular type of upbringing versus another. Or we can look at adopted siblings versus non-adopted siblings and look at differences between those groupings. And when we do that, when we compare these large groups who've had different environmental experiences or who are in different age groups, we can really start to see credible evidence about how those differences really emerge and how those differences really impact people. So when we talk about effects throughout the lifespan development, I want you to be familiar with this idea of correlational changes or regression changes, sometimes called, and differences, because all of these things will be commonly referenced throughout the entire class this semester. Another thing that's really important to understand is a specific research strategy, actually a collection of research strategies that are used in the field of developmental psychology. One of the first most common techniques that was used in early research in developmental psychology was called the cross-sectional approach. Cross-sectional approach is when a researcher actually takes multiple collections of groups of individuals of different ages and compares them at the exact same time. So if I wanted to run a cross-sectional study on, say, reading speed, I would collect a bunch of people at age 5, a bunch of people at age 10, a bunch of people at age 15, a bunch of people at age 20, collect all of these groups of individuals and measure them right now and compare the reading speeds of those groups. And it can give me a very quick snapshot of the differences that we see between those age groups. But a lot of people, when we run these cross-sectional approaches or cross-sectional designs, worry about something that we call cohort effects. Changes that happen from group to group, not because of their actual age, but because something that particular group experienced. Maybe people at age 15 right now were a product of some special education program that the government initiated that really sped them up in their reading development. Or maybe people at age 5 now have struggled in reading because of some of the government setbacks that happened a few years ago. We were not sure exactly what could possibly cause changes, but the concern is always with cohort effects that the differences we're seeing from age group to age group has nothing to do with the actual developmental process, but instead differences from the experiences that these groups have encountered. And because of that, many developmental psychologists have argued that instead of using this cross-sectional approach, which is much faster, much easier to run, we should instead run what's called longitudinal studies, or use the longitudinal approach to research. It's a strategy where instead of measuring multiple groups of people of different ages, we measure one group of individuals for a very long extended period of time. And since we're talking about developmental psychology across the lifespan, to run a true longitudinal study, we have to study a group of individuals for not 1, 2, 3, or 4 years. We have to study them usually for decades to truly get a sense of how the developmental process happens. And as you might guess, yes, the cohort effects are a little bit less prominent in these, even though they can sometimes still emerge. They can affect everybody within a culture in a subtle way, and we can't really control for those things. One of the things that often happens with these longitudinal studies is there's lots of attrition issues that we have, people just kind of falling off because they don't want to participate anymore, or we lose contact with them. And oftentimes another big issue that happens is it's really, really expensive. So sometimes research projects that have people that are still accessible can't afford to pay for these individuals to come in or to track these individuals after, say, 10 to 20 years of studying them. Because of that, sometimes people have kind of looked at a hybrid of cross-sectional longitudinal studies. So they study 10 different groups of age groups, so 5-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 15, 20, 25-year-olds like we talked about, and they follow those groups for a series of years, so maybe 5 years. And when they do that, they essentially get the benefits of the cross-sectional approach, the benefits of the longitudinal approach, with removing some of the costs that are out there, the expense costs and the cohort effects that sometimes can really impact their measures. Now, It's not always a perfect design, but when we look at studies, when we look at approaches, all of these are used, and you need to be familiar with those terms. So when you hear about different studies that are out there, you can differentiate between which type of study was actually used to get the results that were there, and that might also attune you to some of the major issues that might have popped up because of the approach that was used in that study. All right, that marks the end of today's lecture. Make sure that you actually do the readings from Chapter 1 before you post the write-up. Also, make sure by the time you get ready for the next presentation that you have Chapter 2 read. If you don't have the book, obviously get that right away. And remember, write-up due number 1 is due very, very soon. So email me if you have questions, but get going on that right away. Best of luck to you, and I'll see you all soon.